This episode is brought to you by the V1 Project. Before we dive into today's episode of the LiftAffect podcast, I want to tell you about something that's really quite special to me. It's called the V1 Project, and it's all about bringing professional pilots together to create a supportive community. You know, being a pilot is more than just a job. It's a way of life. The V1 Project is here to help you cultivate a core set of values and virtues that will help you enhance not just your career, but all aspects of your life. Many of you have reached out and asked about the LiftAffect Mental Skills course for value-based living. While we're not offering that course right now as a standalone course, we have included it as the first 4 months of the V1 Project. So if you want to take that course, you got to go into the V1 Project to get it. But here's the thing. The V1 Project is not just about what you learn, it's about who you meet. It's all about building a strong sense of community. Picture yourself surrounded by like-minded individuals, all on a journey to better themselves and to support each other. Our motto says it all. V1 is a place for professional pilots to build community, cultivate and develop and express a core set of values and virtues for optimal living in a supportive community with encouragement and professional guidance. So if you're a professional pilot looking for something more, something that'll take your career and your life to the next level, head on over to the v1project.com. That's www.thev1 as in the number 1, not O-N-E, but 1, project.com. Join the V1 Project today, and let's go. Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the LiftAffect podcast. I am your host, Matt McNeil, founder, clinical director, and director of human performance at LiftAffect, where we assist professional pilots with maintaining better mental health and optimizing their mental skills. The goal of this podcast is simple: to help pilots and other high liability professionals and disciplines come out of the shadows to discover how we can live better lives personally and professionally. Join us each episode as we discuss various topics ranging from mental health, mental skills and performance, to business, entrepreneurship, and a few other surprises along the way.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the latest and newest LiftAffect podcast. I'm your host, Karl Keller. I'm finally back after a 2-week hiatus, and along with the main man, as always, Matt McNeil. Hey, buddy. How's it feel to have someone to spar against?
It's not so lonely.
Yeah, that was kind of a bummer about our last podcast.
Yeah, that was my fault.
Yeah, life goes on.
It was my error. But I think we got the mic working, so we're good.
Yeah. How's your week going? It's
it was 90 degrees yesterday, which was fabulous. It's been in the 60s for the last month or 2 months. It's rained every day. I've never seen it rain as much in Colorado. I mean, people are freaking out. They're like, we need the rain. It's good.
Yeah.
But it's weird. It's like living in Seattle. It's just overcast, raining all the time. And guess what it's doing today? Raining. So, but yesterday was 90. You know, we finished up work and we were like, let's go to the pool. So we went to the pool.
Yeah, I'm more of a 60s, 70s kind of guy. I like it where if it's cool enough, you can wear a sweater if you want and not.
That's why you live on the East Coast, buddy.
Well, when I lived in Virginia, that's where we live now. When we first moved here, it had more of multi-seasons. But lately, we haven't had much of a winter, and we've had more of a really hot summer and a really warm fall and spring. So it's we didn't have any snow this year. None. So
I know, I heard that. That's kind of nuts.
Yeah, it was kind of a bummer. But be that as it may. Hey,
okay, well, we've got the meteorology covered.
Yeah, no kidding. All right. Well, hey, look how successful they are if they're just right 30% of the time.
Hey, just like baseball players, right?
Yeah.
30% of the time, man, you are like an all-star. A 300, if you're batting a 300, you're...
I'll triple that. What if I only land well 90% of the time? What do you think?
As long as you can walk away.
Yeah. What do they say? Any landing you walk away is a good one?
I'd say you greased it.
Oh, my God. Hey, after as a listener, I got to listen to your last podcast on mental health. I thought it was excellent. And I'm going to pick out of we have several questions today, so I'm going to kind of go around and to touch different things. But one of them I thought was really good, and that kind of piggybacks off last week. And it says, "Hi, Matt and Karl. Thanks for the podcast. Matt, can you please do more deep dives on specific mental health issues like depression, anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder, schizophrenia, maybe from a pilot perspective? This is purely from a curiosity one. I promise I won't try to diagnose myself or my crazy family members." Well, that you don't have to be a pilot to have crazy family members,
No,
let me tell you.
Just have to have family.
Yes, you do.
So you want more deep dives on specific. So I've kind of avoided that because
Do you want to save that for a more in-depth, future one?
I think we could do it. I've avoided it because I was always concerned that people would start to try to diagnose themselves or diagnose other people. Be like, "Hey, you are depressed," and because I heard Matt say this, and I'm a pilot, and pilots know everything. I can do anything.
I slept at a Holiday Inn Select last night.
Yeah, no, but a pilot is, you need an appendectome. I'm a pilot. I can do it. I can figure out it with YouTube. I'm a pilot. I can do it. Pilots can do anything. Didn't you know that?
In between flights, while we're
right. Yeah, I'm
on
a pilot.
a turn.
Everybody stand back. I'm a pilot.
Yeah.
I saw this cartoon somebody sent me. It was like one of those like farce or New Yorker cartoons or whatever. And there's all these people around a casket. And the priest says, "Would anybody like to say anything?" And there's this bubble that says, "I'm a pilot." Which is like, it's like that old adage, how do you know what kind of airplane a pilot flies? Don't worry, he'll tell you. It's so, but honestly, that you got to be really careful with this stuff because you don't want people to try to diagnose themselves or someone else think, "Oh, I'm armed with some knowledge here. I'm going to see it." It's kind of like if you buy a red car and then you as soon as you drive off the lot, all you see is red cars in that same car that you never noticed before. See, I don't want people to be doing that to themselves or to others. That's the first reason I haven't done it. Second is because I'm not a huge fan of diagnosing. I think and honestly, even the people that wrote the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic Statistician's Manual on how we classify mental health diseases, even the people that wrote it say, this is kind of ridiculous that we're classifying the brain, the most complicated thing in the world, with these diseases. Here's some symptoms. That means you have this. So I'm not a huge fan of it, but what would be the utility of talking about it? What's your thoughts,
I think
Karl?
It's I guess in my mind after listening to what you said last week, sometimes people are looking for, okay, on some of these, as you go down the spider, down the rabbit hole, people just like you were talking about symptoms. What are signs? What are things that? Yeah, and because I know I always look in the mirror and I say, be honest with yourself. Look at yourself and go, what are you doing good? What are you doing bad? What's going on that's different? Is there anything that I should be concerned about? We may not go to our doctor to tell him everything we should. Mm-hmm. We should honestly do, but we don't. Right. But don't lie to yourself. Mm-hmm. And sometimes, we're in that denial stage, but sooner or later you get to the fact that something's not right. What is it? What's going on? And I think it's like a little bit of knowledge. It's like having a skeleton. I don't know I may not know how everything connects inside when you put the flesh and the organs in, but I want to have a basic framework. Okay, there are indications that this is something. And it might be, other, like you were saying, the difference between a panic attack and something that's a little bit more serious. Panic attacks aren't life-threatening, type thing. Is this so when you're talking about these things, is this something that I need to worry about, or is it this will pass kind of thing? Yeah. So I think that's what people are looking for, is a little bit of knowledge, not enough to operate on themselves, so to speak, but enough to say, hey, I can't ignore this anymore. I got to do something. Like you said, it's for pilots. It takes 10 years on average. That's a long time.
Well, average no.
But you still get there.
That 10 years is the normal population. The pilots is never. They just
but
don't reach out until they're bleeding out on the side of the road. But that's changing, and that's the whole point of what we're trying to do.
I think this is.
Yeah, we could delve into some things, and maybe it's more from a curiosity perspective too. Like I think people just like to learn things, and I think it's useful to learn. But I just want to add the disclaimer: like, do not try to diagnose yourself or somebody else. That would be the worst thing you could do with this information. So we can do some episodes maybe on. I mean, what are maybe the most common things, or maybe the most common things we see at LiftAffect? Maybe that would be. We could do that
in a general sense. Yeah,
we can do that. Not today, but we'll do that. Yeah, I'll commit to doing a few deep dives on specific mental disorders or issues that are what we call diagnosing. We can talk about that for sure.
I got another question that I think plays into one of your strengths and one of your issues that you're very, very firm and very serious about. And the last two podcasts, you were actually talking about the science of breathing. So this question here goes, you mentioned in a recent podcast that anecdotal evidence is actually an important part in science. That was surprising to me, since I've always been under the impression that anecdotes were BS, just opinion. Can you explore what good science is and what bad science is? I feel like this is was a huge issue during COVID.
Yeah. So I think what I had said was and I recall talking about anecdotes sort of. What I said was that anecdotes, there's this idea that if it's an anecdotal versus, double-blind controlled, trials, the gold standard of science, and maybe we could break down a little bit of what that actually means. Maybe.
Sure. When I read that and when I saw that, what I glommed onto more importantly was that sentence. What is good science and what is bad science?
What is good science and what is bad science?
That was the bigger issue. Yeah, you're right. Anecdotes sometimes are just opinions, and I don't care who you are. Everybody, it's hard sometimes not to let some personal thoughts get in there, as hard as you try to be. But I think what's more important is what is good science and what's bad science.
Right. Well, let me just clarify the anecdote. So anecdote is good science. There's an idea, I think there's a misperception about anecdotes, that if it's anecdotal, it's not useful. And that's actually not true. Anecdotes are so, for example, a lot of what the information that I have at LiftAffect is we haven't quantified. I mean, some things we've quantified. But some things we have not quantified. And, but I can tell you from the experience of working with lots of pilots, for example, that our experience is this. That would be anecdotal evidence. Does that make sense? And that doesn't mean that it's not legit or that it's not useful. It just means that it's an observation, but it hasn't been quantified yet. So that's kind of like maybe, a place to start with anecdotes. But let's talk about, Karl, give me your opinion on like what is good science, what is bad science, sort of from your perspective. And then I can give you mine, but you kind of represent the listener.
Well, and now you're going to have somebody going out there and say, Karl doesn't represent
me. He doesn't speak
who the
for
heck
me.
Does he think? Who the heck does he think he is?
Right. But you're not a researcher, and neither am I, for that matter. But you're not a scientist, or you're not working in a clinical practice or whatever. But what's your?
I think, and I'm not sure if this is going to come across right, but to me, bad science is when somebody takes bits and pieces from facts, from known knowledge, and then creates a conclusion from that has no basis because they're random points. There was nothing that tied them together. They basically created their false narrative. As an example, flat Earth. Did you
ever see that documentary? Did you see the flat Earth documentary?
I've seen documentaries on, I don't know if I've seen the same one, but I've seen different things about people who believe in flat Earth, and they come up with their science, and I'm going, I feel like you took random points of fact and you spun it to the way you want. There's, basically, if you take anything out of context, you can create your own narrative. I mean, and that's what so many people do. They'll take a paragraph, they'll take a snippet out of it and say, see there, that proves my point.
Right.
That to me that's not fact. That's not science. That's cherry picking with whatever you want that will support your conclusion, regardless of where the facts in reality lead you.
Right.
That's my long-winded explanation of bad science.
Yeah. I mean, God, man, there's so much to this. It's hard to even know where to start. Well, let me start with
what's your definition of bad science?
Bad science is one that doesn't follow a process, a rigorous, empirically validated scientific process from conception of idea to the execution. That's what bad science is, to me. Where it skips steps, or it doesn't account for extraneous variables and some of these other kinds of things. But can we talk about like what and I'm actually working on this. I am working on some scientific studies that LiftAffect is a part of. I'm a part of some of this, and we're in IRB approval right now. We're waiting for IRB, this is review board approval. But I can tell you what are the steps that we have followed to be able to create good science around this. Would that be useful?
Sure.
Okay.
I mean, the thing is, to me, I'm looking at is you're always coming from a science-based perspective,
right?
That this is where the science leads you. So right. I think in this way, it's good to say, okay, all right, where is your underpinning? Where's your foundation on hard science?
Okay, so
that's what you're kind of going to give.
So let's start with where does science start with? That everybody can relate to. I want this to be relatable for everybody. So the first thing that you do when you're thinking about creating an experiment, let's say, and science is about experimentation, right? To be able to get some meaningful explanations. It's not to prove something. There is no proof. There's only disproving. You never really get to absolute proof because it changes, but you disprove. So you start with a hypothesis, and the hypothesis is it's there's a default position in an experiment, in that there's no relationship between two phenomena. This is called the null hypothesis. Okay, that's what you start with. Then you design an experiment. That's called experimental design, and we can get into the different types of designs that you can come up with. Not all designs are the same. There's many different types of designs. So you create a design. How do we want to test this? Then you do an analysis for power. Power means how much significance does the results generate, and there are factors that determine power. Then you go to a review board, right? That's where is this ethical? Can we even do this? And when you want science to be published, I mean, you can go create your own experiments in your kitchen sink, and that's cool. But if you want to be able to publish results, and we can talk about how things are published, what is meaningful published versus not meaningful published, and we're going to get into that in a second. But you publish it, and there's appropriate, more respected places to publish. And then there's primary, secondary outcomes, protocols, stats plan, pre-registration, so on and so forth, after you get an IRB approval. So let's talk about the null hypothesis. So good science is, I would say, is generally hypothesis driven. That's what good science is. The null hypothesis takes the position that there is no relationship between two phenomena. So, okay, Karl, come up with an example. Just create a little scientific experiment. It can be very simple.
Oh, geez.
Come up with something, man. Whatever. Doesn't matter.
The relationship to, in this case, for where you are right now, rain and a greenery.
Rain and greenery. Okay, fine.
Yeah.
So the hypothesis is that more rain equals. So you're making a hypothesis that more rain equates with more green?
Yeah, as an example, like no rain and everything dies or dries up because there's nothing for nourishment for the plants.
So if the null hypothesis, it takes the position that there's no relationship between the two phenomena. What is the null hypothesis in that experiment?
The null that it
no
won't,
relationship.
What clothes I wear today, no.
I love this.
Well,
okay, let's okay, forget. Let's do one here. Okay. How about this? What color are my eyes? What color are my eyes? You look into my eyes. What color are they?
It's hard to tell here. It looks like maybe brown.
They're brown. Okay, they're dark. I don't have blue eyes. I've got a coffee cup in my hand. So maybe there's a hypothesis. Might be that drinking coffee makes your eyes turn darker. Okay, that's a hypothesis that that we could test. And so you've got to frame it in a way that says that the null hypothesis is that when you drink coffee, your eyes do not change in color in any way. There's no relationship. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So that would imply that the alternative, so HOHA, we're talking null versus alternative. The alternative hypothesis is that when you drink coffee, your eyes do change color. Okay? So we've got a null and we have an alternative. Now, this is good. We're talking about good science. We're setting up an experiment. Whether it's a useful experiment doesn't matter, right? That's sort of, we laugh at this, but the reality is you can just assume, oh, well, we know drink coffee doesn't change your eyes color. Well, how do you know that? You have to test it. So it starts with a hypothesis. It starts with the null. There's no relationship. It starts with the alternative hypothesis. Now remember, science is not about proving, it's only about disproving. So the alternative hypothesis is, okay, if I drink coffee, my eyes are going to change color. But here's the deal, right? Because I am specifying what color it changes to, or maybe I'm specifying what color it changes to. Does it get darker? Does it get lighter? Does it change? Does it make my eyes more hazel or more green? So to be able to formulate that cleanly, what you've got to do is you have to conduct an experiment. So how are you going to test this? How are you going to test the hypothesis? Now, the best way, the gold standard, what they consider the gold standard, and we could even argue, is that the gold standard? And there's a lot of argument right now about, is this actually the gold standard? But let's just kind of go with what is most accepted, is to do a randomized controlled experiment. And what's better is, even if it's total, if you're blind to it, some of the questions that you could ask around this experiment would be, we're saying that the alternative hypothesis is that if I drink coffee, my eyes change color. So now we got to come up with some questions around, like some meaningful questions that we can test in our experiment. So it would be, how frequently do you have to drink coffee for the experiment? Or how long should I drink the coffee for? Or how are we going to measure my eye color? So that's like just an example of these are questions when you're starting to figure out how to test something. how to even ask a meaningful question, you have to think of these factors. So think about like when you read about studies that they've done, did they do some of these things? Or was it just like, I had a client that was like, I'll leave that example for a second. She was reading a study that freaked her out, and it was like, okay, but that wasn't like really a study. It was a very quick observational, study that was not science. It wasn't experimental. There wasn't, they didn't really ask a lot of questions here. So I'm not saying that doesn't mean it's totally invaluable. It just means what is the depth at which they looked at something. But we're talking about what's the gold standard. What is the best way to do this? So that's how you conduct the experiment. So how are you going to test the hypothesis? And then what are some of the questions you're going to be asking in the test? And then you have to analyze. We talked about the power analysis. So an important variable in power, what's often related to when somebody says this has more statistical power, one of the variables is how many subjects you have. If you only have 2, right? Well, that's lower power than if you have 2,000 or 50,000. And so now there is a finite number to where you don't get any more power out of it. And that is dependent on a bunch of different things. And there's a lot of, we use computers that crunch these numbers and be able to determine where the power is. But that's something that you need to think about in terms of your analysis. Another thing is that how many arms of the study will you have in the study? Like how many different? How do you branch this out? That's something that is an important question in terms of the analysis. So that's that phase. Then you get into IRB approval. So if the study involves human beings, or does it involve mice? They call that animal studies. Humans are animals too, but we say human subjects are animal subjects. And you're going to have to get something called an institutional review board to approve the ethics of that study. Is this ethical to do on humans? Is it ethical to do on animals? And, there's a lot of controversy around that. I have animals. I like animals. I think, it's rough, what is done to animals. They experiment on animals and do things that they would never do to a human being. But they do them on animals. And so you can have your own opinions about that. I struggle with it. I knew I never was going to be able to be a biological scientist because I didn't want to do the experiments on cats and mice. And, I just didn't want to do it. So you get approval. Let's say they say, okay, your approval. Then you got to determine your primary and your secondary outcomes. So you have to get the protocol approved. You've got to develop a plan for statistics, and then you have to register the study. And also, a big factor in this is you have to get funding to do this. These are not cheap to do. Studies are especially if they're complicated and they're involving people. And so it's like we're doing studies with pilots. Is what are the how do pilots perform with maybe mental health issues or some of these things, though this is expensive to do.
Yeah, one of the ones they've always talked about is what is the effects of going over the pole radiation-wise.
Right.
That's versus not,
That's right.
Long-term effects.
Right.
That is one that has been talked about.
And I think part of the frustration that pilots have is they're like, why do we not know this stuff? Like, can't they just get the data? Well, it's not that simple. Just because you have data doesn't mean that it fits into into the study design. It doesn't mean that the data is approaching the right questions that you're asking. So this is this is difficult. And so we're talking about experimental now. When studies are not experimental, some of these steps are skipped, right? You don't need to do them. And so the types of studies that we have, let's talk about different kinds of studies. There's observational studies. There are papers that analyze or review studies. They look at studies and they go, okay, I'm going to take all the studies that were done and I'm going to review those studies. And there's experimental studies. What else would be? Well, I mean, what are your thoughts just on initial thoughts on this? Does it make sense?
Yeah,
Does it seem
I mean, the one that you
complicated?
hear the most about are the ones that are the double blind, where you have the control and you have the one that's actually using it. So the placebo, when you're using the idea about the eyes, the one gets a dark colored substance that has a coffee flavor, but it's not coffee, versus the other one gets coffee, And so, do they come up with any statistical variances, or is it the same? So that's what I've always looked at. The other one is the peer reviews, where you take a number of studies and you look and say, are there any conclusions? Are there similarities or things that you can create that there's similarities in here? They're all coming to similar conclusions on a subject from different perspectives that weren't started by the same people.
Yep. So there's a diagram that Purdue University has, and actually, I wonder if I can I open this? Yeah, there it is. Hold on. Here's a diagram. Let me show you this really quick. This is a cool diagram that I'm going to show you, which actually in some respects I kind of disagree with it. But it's and I'll explain why. So are you seeing this picture?
It's coming up now.
Okay. So this is Purdue University. I've got this as bookmarked from way back in the day. I have my bookmarks all the way from grad school, which is kind of funny. I've imported all of them. But here's the different types of studies. We're looking at a pyramid, and we can link to it in the show notes. Now, one thing that's sort of misleading about this is that it looks like there's a hierarchy. When you ever see a pyramid, you think of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. That's I think pilots are most familiar with. But there's a pyramid, and the reality is this doesn't suggest that something is better than the other. It's just different. Which is why I get a little upset with it's not double blind controlled trial. It's not experimental enough. It's no good. Well, that's just not true. That's not true.
What I see and this is the first time I've seen this.
Yeah.
Is I'm looking at the very bottom is just background and just compiling the information.
Right.
And then the other three, which are observational, experimental, and critical appraisal, the different items that are in each one of those are, I think, different levels of the rigorousness of the evaluation and the level of studies that are in there. Observational, to me, is less rigorous than experimenting or doing a critical appraisal. So I think there is a hierarchy here, because you're basically saying the higher you go in this list from individual case reports to non-randomized control to systematic reviews to meta-analysis, those are all much there is a level there of
but it doesn't equate
specificity
with meaning. And that's the difference. So yes, there is different levels of rigor, but all of these things, I mean, individual case reports, which they put at the bottom, those are very, very important. Individual case reports are how science has changed sometimes. It's how questions are asked. I just want to encourage you to think that it's not a hierarchy. That's the problem. And I've seen this presented where it's ladder. It's parallel. It's not one is better than the other. And so I think this is a big error I see with people that are looking at reports, is that, it's if it's just an individual case report, it just doesn't have as much meaning or significance as something else. I don't think that that's true.
See, I guess from my perspective, it would be because it's just one data point. Is this 1 in a million? Is this something that's more common and people just haven't reported it? Versus when you're actually doing controlled tests where you're having, like you say, a number of subjects, whether animal or human. Well, to me, you're getting a greater look at this issue versus just a random.
But the implications of how these things are used are important. And so the value of individual case reports, especially when you're looking at something like medicine, is that when somebody comes into a clinic, let's say, and they've got a certain condition and there's a certain lab value that might be like sky high, and then somebody goes to the literature to search for it, they're going to see that report, that individual case report, and hopefully it'll save them time in getting the diagnosis correct. And so that is very different than looking at a massive randomized controlled trial of thousands of people to try to glean, how to treat things, how to approach it. So there's huge value, and it depends on the domain that you're talking about. But in terms of medicine, individual case reports are how a lot of people are saved, is because of individual case reports. So let's keep going though.
Well, could I step back for a second, just
Yes.
to kind of go back up to the 10 or 20,000 foot view? All of these, whether it starts at the very bottom and all goes all the way to top or goes from left to right if you're doing horizontal, these are all different levels of good science.
Yes. These are different levels of good science, of how things are created. Yep.
And I think that was really not how good it is, how, whether it's good or gooder or goodest, these are all different ways to do good science.
That's right. So then there's case series or sets of studies. So here is where you're doing the same thing, but then you would look at more than just one case review. You would look at several. So looking back so one of the things they're doing at LiftAffect is looking back at clinical data and noticing that, let's say we had 35 people over the last 12 months that have demonstrated a very, specific thing. So like, for example, COVID, maybe we're saying, boy, it seems like there's been an uptick in brain fog that happened during these months of COVID, or circadian disruption or something else. And so what you could do is you could take that and then you could write a paper that looks at all of these, seemingly spontaneous increases or regressions in a certain type of condition. And this, that's very, very important. That's what a case series is. Cohort studies are larger studies, and they can be there's two ways they can be looked at: retrospective or prospective. So a retrospective cohort study looks backwards in time. It's looking back in retrospect. So you go back and you look at all the people who've let's say pilots who have flown east across the pond that had depression, or flown west across the pond that had depression. That would be a way of looking at a retrospective look. It's observational. There's no intervention in it. And the hope that when you do this is that you're going to see some sort of pattern in it. That's the advantage of a cohort. Now, it's not experimental. We're not even doing an experiment, but you're still looking at patterns. There's value in that. That's real science. That's not voodoo science. And hopefully you'll be able to establish causality in the pattern. That's the point of that. Prospective is when you would follow people over the next certain period of time, whether it's 12 months or it's 5 years or it's 20 years of, let's say, pilots that have flown east across the pond a certain number of times per year, or west a certain number of times per year, and then compare them to similar numbers of like pilots who didn't fly across the pond. And so in a forward-looking orientation, we're going to be examining other behaviors of these people and ultimately what their outcomes are. Do they have different rates of mortality? I know there's been questions about, do cargo pilots die younger or sooner than pilots who are not cargo? And so what is that? Is it because they're up at night more? Is it maybe because there's some other type of environmental factor that cargo pilots fly versus passenger pilots? I don't know. There's a lot of assumptions there. Bad science would say, well, we looked at cargo pilots and they die at 67 and passenger pilots die at 70. So cargo flying is just, it's the fact that they fly cargo is the problem. Well, no. Is it because of circadian disruption? Is it? I mean, that's the point of what would be good science versus bad science. Then you get to experimental studies. There's non-randomized trials, which sometimes gets referred to as open label trials. And this is where you take two groups of people and you give one of them the treatment, and the other they get a placebo, which is nothing, or a different treatment. But you don't randomize the selection in terms of it. There's a reason that they're in the group. And so that's non-randomized. Randomized is where you and that's the gold standard. This is where whatever question you want to study, you study it, but you attempt to take all the bias out of it by randomly assigning people into the treatment group. And how do you randomize it? There's computers that can do that. There's even randomized number charts that you can just Google it and you can see how to randomly select numbers. And then blinding is another aspect of where the experimenters may be blind to who gets into which cohort, and obviously the participants are blind. Meta-analysis, I'm just looking at this chart. I think that's enough. I think that's enough for this. So the point of this is that scientific studies are really complicated. And that's why people that do science, that's why anybody that's going to run a scientific study needs to have a PhD to even get IRB approval for the most part, because they need to have the background in experimental design and in statistics to even be able to approach how do you design some of this? How do you approach some of this? How do you run a study? And then how do you interpret the results? It's not simple. But not all science, just because it's not randomized, double-blind, controlled trials or design, doesn't mean that it's bad science. It can mean it's good science, but it doesn't mean that it's good science. That's my point. And one of the things that frustrates me is that sometimes clients will come to me and they'll say, "Well, I read this study, and this says that eating eggs is bad, and then the other study says that eating eggs is good. Well, which one is it? Why do they keep changing it? It must all be bullshit." Well, I don't think it's as simple as that. It depends on what was the experimental question that was being asked. What was the hypothesis? What are the extraneous variables? What was the design of the study? That's my point.
I have a question for you. To me, mental health is, when you're dealing with the mind, it's so complex. And the effects of that on each person are unique. Do you feel like that there's a lot of science in the mental health area, or is it the majority still more hypotheses of things that they're trying to prove and to like you say, process of elimination type thing? Because it seems like they were constantly seeing new things, and there's been a lot of progress recently, but is that because of science, or just because we're now delineating and categorizing things more accurately and better?
I think it's 90% because of science. I think that science is it allows formal process that can be rigored to certain levels. And I think without that, we would be still bloodletting. We would be still hitting people in the head with rocks. If you look at the history of psychiatry, it was gruesome what they did to people. They did lobotomies on people. Stuck pokers up people's noses. And they did bloodletting, and they used magnets and did all sorts of stuff. I guess they are actually doing magnetic resonance stuff now, but I think without science, we would be in deep trouble. It's not perfect. And I think people get frustrated when they go, well, shit, it's like they said it's one thing and now they're saying it's not. Well, those damn liars. And I think that's like a bit of a simplistic view of what the purpose of science is. It's not perfect. But that's the equivalent of saying, the FOM, the way that Boeing put out the FOM for the Max, that's how they published it. You got to fly it that way. And why would they change it? Well, you change it when you get more information. In aviation, we know everything is written in accidents, and
in
so
blood.
In blood. And so it's not like, I think, but even in aviation safety, that is science. It's not like, it's not like just opinions. They look at this stuff and they create hypotheses and then they test it as best they can. And it comes out of observation. It starts with observation. So I think we would be in really deep trouble if we didn't have science with mental health.
I guess I've talked to not a ton of doctors, but quite a few that have said with all the science, medicine is still, it's almost like an art. As much as we know, there's so much more that we don't. And I guess to me, mental health, because the mind is even more complex than so many of our other
Super
organs and symptoms. It just, to me, I'm going sometimes, science is the standard to which we are moving towards, but I was going more to the fact isn't an awful lot of mental health still an art, because we're still trying to see the complexities and understand its impact on us as different events unfold.
Yes.
So that was what I was really trying to get to. I guess I just didn't word it well.
So mental health is, what we know about mental health is like the tip of the pen. That's what we know about it. And it's not as clear cut as like, I don't know, a mole. Is the mole cancerous or not? Is the mole gonna create a problem down the road, or a polyp? When you do a colonoscopy, like they know, okay, polyps can turn into cancer. The brain and like depression, and part of the problem with mental health is that it's like context driven. It depends on psychosocial factors, and it depends on environment, and it depends on what we think. It depends on chemical stuff. The chemical imbalance hypothesis. I mean, that's all been proven that's not true. They don't know. It's a chemical imbalance. It's a chemical imbalance. Well, that's not actually supported by science. That's a hypothesis. That's an idea. But the science doesn't actually support that. The brain is super complicated. And one of the biggest issues as well is it's transitory. 1 minute you can be doing really well, let's say mentally, and then something can happen or something can shift, and all of a sudden you're not doing very well. And so it's like you're kind of like chasing this thing around. It's like trying to herd cats. Whereas I think a lot of other, like engineering, is very different, And so engineers and medicine, there's a bit of, engineers want everything to be super concrete. And
it's easier for them because of the properties of the materials they're using.
Exactly.
Are very set. There's no
stable.
The variables and the variations are either quantifiable or they're non-existent.
Exactly.
Versus like the brain, the neurons and the pathways are just,
it's just so complicated. It's so complicated. There's more neurons in our head than stars in the galaxy, and I think, but science is allowing discoveries, and it's these amazing researchers that are asking questions, and they're not going in saying, I know that this is that. No good researcher with their salt would say, we know it's this. They would never say. They would say, well, we think it's probably not that, but it might be this. It might be get us closer. But it's the willingness to be wrong and to say, well, what we thought, now we've got more information, and we asked some different questions, and we looked at, and now we don't think that so much that anymore. We now think maybe it's moving more toward this.
Yeah, I mean, look at the cosmos, the things that we accepted as scientific fact over years have been either disproven, or the fidelity of them goes, okay, what we had assumed was a constant wasn't, and now it changes this. So I think things are like that. But to close this all up, since we're getting near the end of this podcast, I just want to say that everything scientifically revolves around what clothes I wear today. I just want to bring this full circle here.
It revolves around the coffee I drink and my eye color too.
No, well, I'm just looking at, I'm wearing a green shirt today, so that means it's got to be green outside. See, there's my.
There's such I love this topic because, my favorite classes in graduate school were experimental design because it was just slogging it. It was so like hard to get this right, and it was like, we would get it wrong all the time. And it was so much. Some people either hate it or you absolutely love it. If you like things to be super concrete, you're going to hate it.
Let me ask you a quick question before, just because you said that. The courses you took back in college 15, 20 years ago, and the information
in grad school
that was
really.
available.
Yeah.
But if a younger version of you were to go take those same courses today, do you feel like the hypotheses and the rigor would be significantly different? I would think it would, because of the information and the things that have occurred in that period of time. So it would be a very different class, if you took it again.
Yeah, I think it's what the difference is, and I still keep up on it quite a bit. And I do continuing education courses on this, and I just, because I enjoy it, I think it's really cool. And I am not a researcher. That is not my role. I'm a clinician. I'm not a researcher. The fundamentals are the same. Good hypotheses, bias. We didn't even get into bias. We could do a whole thing on what are the different kinds of biases that happen with science, just in our life too. How are we being biased? Those things don't change. Hypotheses, null hypotheses, experimental, non-experimental. There's parametric, non-parametric statistics. Those do not change. What has changed is how you get to those answers. The methods and the really the computer programming.
The tools.
The tools are so different now. I mean, when I took multiple regressions in grad school, like, you had to do it by hand, which was like, pages and pages and pages of mathematics, basically, to create a regression line. And now it's like, it's good to know how to do that, but you just put it in a computer and it's done. It just does it for you. It shows the regression line and how you regressions to the mean and all that. So they have like tools now that are so like measuring things in different ways, and reverse engineering, and the predictive value of these things are just insane, absolutely incredible with what they're doing. It's a constantly evolving field. So, but I think the point, that's the takeaway. The takeaway is, don't, just because something is observational or single case study or huge randomized controlled trials, or it's retrospective or prospective, I wouldn't judge it as like, oh, this is garbage, or this is the greatest thing ever. I think it's way more nuanced than that. And, don't take everything as gospel, what you read. It's some of it's very important. Some of it's pretty hard to argue, but I wouldn't say things are just, it is this way. It's like, no, it's getting us closer to what we think is the truth, but we never really get there. We never totally get there. That's the point, I think, of getting into this today.
Well, as you can see, we obviously take listener questions very seriously. Please keep them coming in. podcast@lifteffect.com is where you send them. As always, hit the like button, leave a comment, give us however many stars you think we deserve. Everything helps us spread the word, talk to other people. You hear me say this at the end of every podcast. We're trying to expand our listener audience, and there's no better way for people to believe than for someone to sit there and say, hey, you need to listen to this. 100%. So we thank you, and we appreciate you as always. We look forward to seeing you on our next podcast. Have a great day.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the LiftAffect podcast. If you want to dive deeper into this episode and every episode, go to our website, LiftAffect.com/podcast. If you're enjoying the show, we would love it if you'd follow us on Spotify and rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts. We really appreciate your support. You can find me on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, all with the ID Matthew McNeil. This show is brought to you by LiftAffect, a clinical mental health and consulting company that assists air carriers, corporate flight departments, pilot unions, and commercial pilots by providing comprehensive psychotherapy and mental skills coaching services to pilots with mental health and mental performance-related issues. Visit LiftAffect.com, that's LiftAffect.com, to book your free consultation. And finally, this podcast is for general informational purposes only. It does not constitute the practice of counseling, psychotherapy, medicine, or any other healthcare service, including the giving of medical advice. No therapeutic or provider-patient relationship is formed. The use of this information and any materials linked to this podcast is at the user's own risk. The content of this podcast is not intended to be a substitute for professional psychological advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Users should not disregard or delay in obtaining advice for any psychological or medical condition they have, and they should seek the assistance of their healthcare professionals for any such conditions. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on the LiftAffect podcast.